The boarding call came just after 6 in the morning, cutting through the fluorescent hum of Gate 27B at Denver International Airport. Flight 1847 to Washington, D.C. 3 hours and 45 minutes. No delays. Kira Vance stood near the back of the business class line, passport in hand, wearing a slate gray windbreaker and faded jeans. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot. No makeup. No jewelry except for a worn watch with a cracked face that she never removed. She looked like any other professional traveler heading east for business. Unremarkable. Forgettable. That was the point. She had not spoken a word since clearing security. When the gate attendant scanned her ticket, Kira nodded once and stepped forward. No smile, no wasted movement. Her eyes swept the jetway ahead, noting the angle of the corridor, the placement of the emergency lighting, the distance to the aircraft door. Old habits. She had been out of the service for 18 months now. 18 months since Afghanistan. 18 months since the ambush that killed 3 of her teammates and left her with a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. The Navy had offered her a medal. She had declined. They had offered her a desk job at the Pentagon. She had declined that too. What she could not decline was this trip, not this one. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb was being awarded the Navy Cross posthumously at a ceremony in Washington tomorrow morning. Marcus had been her co-pilot on that final mission. He had died pulling her from the wreckage of their helicopter while enemy fire tore through the darkness around them. She owed him this much. She owed him everything. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 configured for domestic routes with a mix of business and economy seating. Kira moved down the aisle with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago that rushing accomplished nothing. Her seat was 16C, aisle mid-cabin. She had chosen it deliberately during booking, close enough to see both exits, far enough from the cockpit to avoid attention, direct line of sight to the forward galley and the rear lavatories. Kira placed her carry-on in the overhead bin without struggle and lowered herself into the seat with the controlled grace of someone whose body had been trained to occupy space efficiently. She buckled her seatbelt, adjusted the slack, and folded her hands in her lap. Then she began to watch. The plane filled slowly over the next 20 minutes. Business travelers with overstuffed laptop bags, a young couple arguing quietly about their connecting flight, a group of college students heading home for a family event, loud and careless in the way that only the young can be. Kira cataloged each of them with unconscious precision, not judging, just noting. The nervous woman in 12A who kept checking her phone even after the announcement to power down devices. First-time flyer, probably. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the safety card. The heavy-set man in 9D who had already flagged down a flight attendant twice to complain about the temperature. He would be loud if anything went wrong. A liability. The elderly gentleman in 14B who moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. He carried a small pink backpack that clearly did not belong to him, and beside him sat a little girl with blonde pigtails and a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Kira watched the old man help the child buckle her seatbelt. His hands were weathered and spotted with age, but they moved with tenderness. He leaned down and whispered something that made the girl giggle. Grandfather and granddaughter, traveling together. There was a story there. Kira could see it in the way the old man's smile did not quite reach his eyes, in the way he kept glancing toward the window as if looking for something he had lost. She filed it away and continued her survey. 3 rows ahead, a man in his early 40s settled into an aisle seat with the practiced ease of someone who flew often. He wore an expensive watch and a polo shirt that strained against shoulders, built in a gym rather than in the field. As soon as he sat down, he turned to the passenger beside him and launched into a monologue. Yeah, spent 6 years contracting out of Baghdad. Private security. You know how it is. The passenger beside him, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses, clearly did not know how it was. She nodded politely and returned to her magazine. The man kept talking anyway. Kandahar was worse, though. Real Wild West out there. Had some close calls, let me tell you. Kira studied him for a long moment. His name was Cody Tanner. She did not know this yet, but she knew his type. She had met 100 men like him during her years in the service. Men who talked about combat the way other men talked about football games. Men who collected stories like trading cards without ever understanding what those stories cost. She looked at his hands. No calluses where a real shooter would have them. No tan line from a watch worn under tactical gloves. His shoulders were broad, but they moved with the stiffness of someone who had never learned to carry weight over distance. He was not what he claimed to be, not even close. Kira turned her attention elsewhere. As she scanned the cabin, something caught her eye. 4 men, seated in different sections of the aircraft. No apparent connection between them. Row 8, a man in a Navy windbreaker reading a newspaper with studied casualness. Row 15, another man younger wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Row 22, a third heavyset pretending to sleep against the window. Row 28, a fourth lean and watchful positioned near the rear galley. 4 strangers who had boarded separately. 4 men who had not exchanged a single word or glance, but they were breathing at the same rate. Kira had spent enough time around coordinated teams to recognize the signs, the way they held themselves, the subtle awareness of each other's positions, the careful effort to appear unconnected. These men knew each other, and they were waiting for something. She filed the observation away and kept watching. The forward galley was staffed by 2 flight attendants preparing for departure. The first was a young woman in her late 20s moving quickly through the pre-flight checklist with the nervous energy of someone still new to the job. The second was older, mid-40s maybe. Dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back in a neat bun. She moved through the galley with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been doing this for decades. Kira watched her for a moment. The older attendant was checking the emergency equipment with methodical precision, not rushing, not cutting corners. Her name tag read Diane Caldwell. There was something about the way she carried herself, a steadiness that suggested she had seen turbulence before and learned not to fear it. Good. That might matter later. The thought came unbidden and Kira pushed it aside. She was not on a mission. She was not conducting a threat assessment. She was just a civilian passenger on a routine domestic flight heading to Washington for a ceremony she did not want to attend. But old habits die hard, and somewhere in the back of her mind a voice she had learned to trust was whispering that something was not quite right. The captain's voice came over the intercom as the aircraft doors sealed shut. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Ray Hollis speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 1847 with service to Washington Dulles. We're looking at clear skies for most of the trip with some light chop over Kansas. Flight time today is approximately 3 hours and 45 minutes. We'll have you on the ground right around 11:30 Eastern Time." Kira listened to his voice. American accent. Midwest, probably. Smooth cadence with the practiced ease of someone who had made this announcement 1,000 times before. But there was something else there too, a precision in his words that suggested military training. She had heard that precision before, in briefing rooms, in cockpits, in the voices of men who had learned to stay calm when everything around them was falling apart. Captain Ray Hollis was not just an airline pilot. He was something more. The engines hummed to life, and the aircraft began its slow roll toward the runway. Kira watched the cabin settle into the familiar routine of departure. Passengers adjusting their seats, flight attendants checking seatbelts. The young, nervous woman in 12A gripping her armrest with white-knuckled intensity. The aircraft paused at the threshold of the runway engines building power. Then they were moving, accelerating, the ground rushing past the windows in a blur of concrete and painted lines. Kira felt the familiar sensation of lift as the nose rose and the wheels left the earth. The cabin tilted gently as Denver fell away below them, the Rocky Mountains catching the first light of morning in the distance. She did not look out the window. Her eyes stayed on the aisle, scanning the faces of her fellow passengers as they rose into the sky. Not because she expected anything to happen, but because the job had rewired her brain in ways that could not be undone. The seatbelt sign chimed off at 12,000 feet. Passengers began to stir. The college students unbuckled immediately and started passing items back and forth across the rows. The nervous woman in 12A finally released her death grip on the armrest and let out a shaky breath. Cody Tanner was still talking. "The thing about private military work," he was saying to no one in particular, "is that you have to be ready for anything. Split-second decisions, life or death. Most people can't handle that kind of pressure. The woman beside him had given up on her magazine and was staring at the seat back in front of her with the blank expression of someone waiting for the conversation to end. Kira almost felt sorry for her. In the row ahead, the elderly gentleman, Walter Brennan, though Kira did not yet know his name, was helping his granddaughter unwrap a coloring book. The little girl had her stuffed rabbit propped up on the tray table and was explaining something to it in a serious whisper. Walter's smile flickered as he watched her. There was grief in that smile. Kira recognized it immediately. She had seen it in the mirror often enough. He was taking the child somewhere difficult, somewhere painful, and he was doing everything in his power to shield her from the weight of whatever was coming. Kira turned away before the old man could catch her watching. The flight attendants began their beverage service, working their way down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Diane Caldwell pushed the cart with the same unhurried steadiness she had shown in the galley. When she reached Kira's row, she paused. "Something to drink. Water," Kira said. "Thank you." Diane handed her a small bottle and a plastic cup. Their eyes met for just a moment. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The kind that happens when two people who have learned to read others encounter someone who reads them back. Diane moved on without comment. Kira opened the water bottle and took a slow sip. 47 minutes into the flight. Nothing had happened. Nothing was going to happen. She was just a passenger, just a woman flying east with ghosts she could not outrun and a ceremony she could not avoid. That was all. The first sign of trouble came at the 49-minute mark. Kira did not see it happen. She felt it, a shift in the energy of the cabin, a subtle change in the rhythm of movement around her. The kind of thing that most people would never notice, but that years of training had taught her to recognize instantly. She looked up. Row 8. The man in the navy windbreaker was standing in the aisle, stretching as if working out a cramp in his back. Normal behavior, nothing suspicious, except that his eyes were not looking at his muscles. They were looking at the cockpit door. Row 15. The younger man with the baseball cap. He had been reading a magazine for the past half hour, but now the magazine was closed on his lap, and his hands were resting on his thighs. Resting, not relaxed. There was a difference. Row 22, the heavy-set man who had been sleeping. Now his eyes were open, and he was watching the forward cabin with the patient focus of a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Row 28. The fourth man, the one near the rear galley, had risen from his seat and was moving slowly toward the mid-cabin lavatories. 4 men, 4 different positions. All moving at the same moment. They were not breathing at the same rate anymore. They were holding their breath. Kira's heart rate did not change. Her breathing remained steady, but somewhere deep in her chest, a switch flipped from civilian to operational. She kept her hands folded in her lap and continued to watch. The man in the navy windbreaker made his move first. He walked forward with casual confidence, pausing at the galley as if he were heading for the lavatory. The young flight attendant looked up and smiled. "Sir, the forward lavatory is occupied. There's one available in the rear." The man smiled back. "Actually, I need to speak with the captain." The attendant's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, sir, that's not possible during flight." The man reached into his pocket and produced a small tablet. He held it up so the attendant could see the screen. Kira could not see what was displayed, but she saw the attendant's face go pale. "I think you'll find it is," the man said quietly. The attendant's hand moved toward the intercom panel on the galley wall. She never reached it. The man's other hand came up fast, catching her wrist and twisting it away from the panel. In the same motion, he pulled something from inside his jacket. A gun. Small, black, ugly. The attendant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Knock on the door," the man said. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "Tell them there's a medical emergency. Do it now or I put a bullet through your throat." The attendant's hand was shaking as she reached for the cockpit door. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. A moment later, the door opened a crack. The man moved like water flowing through a gap in a dam. He was inside the cockpit before anyone could react, and the door sealed shut behind him. The cabin erupted in the next 3 seconds. The man with the baseball cap was on his feet instantly, producing a pistol from beneath his jacket. He fired once into the ceiling panel above row 10. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Fragments of plastic and insulation rained down like confetti. Screams filled the air. Passengers dove for cover. Someone in the back was sobbing. A baby started crying. The heavy-set man from row 22 surged forward, a knife gleaming in his fist. The fourth man from the rear moved to block the back exit, cutting off any escape. 4 hijackers. Coordinated. Professional. Moving with the precision of men who had done this before. "Sit down." The voice came from the man with the baseball cap. He had positioned himself in the center of the aisle. His pistol raised, his eyes scanning the cabin with cold efficiency. "Everyone sit down and shut up." More screaming. More chaos. He raised the pistol again and fired into the ceiling. The second shot was louder than the first, or maybe it just seemed that way, because Kira's senses were now fully engaged. "Sit down," the man repeated, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Or die." Silence fell like a hammer. Kira had not moved. She sat in 16C with her hands folded in her lap, watching the scene unfold with the detached clarity of someone observing events through a pane of glass. 4 hijackers, 1 in the cockpit, 3 in the cabin, 2 pistols visible, at least 1 knife, unknown additional weapons. The man with the baseball cap, the one who seemed to be coordinating the cabin operation, was moving down the aisle now, his eyes scanning each row like a prison guard conducting a head count. "Phones," he said. "Passports. Put them in the aisle where I can see them. Hands on your heads after that. Anyone who moves without permission gets the knife." He paused at Cody Tanner's row. Tanner was sitting rigid in his seat, his face drained of color. All his bravado about Baghdad and Kandahar had evaporated like morning dew. The hijacker studied him for a moment. "You," he said, "you were talking a lot earlier. Big military contractor. Seen it all. Done it all." Tanner's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Let's see what you've got." The hijacker grabbed Tanner by the collar and hauled him into the aisle. "Show me," he said. "Show me what a big, tough contractor does when things get real." Tanner stumbled. His hands came up in a defensive gesture that was more instinct than training. The hijacker moved faster than seemed possible. 1 strike to the solar plexus. Tanner doubled over. A second strike to the back of his neck. Tanner went down hard, crashing into the armrest of row 11 before crumpling to the floor. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. The hijacker stood over the unconscious man, not even breathing hard. "Anyone else?" he asked. "Anyone else want to be a hero?" Silence. "That's what I thought." He stepped over Tanner's body and continued down the aisle. Kira watched him come. She had learned what she needed to learn. These men were not amateurs. They had training, discipline, the kind of coordination that came from working together for months or years. But they had also made a mistake. They had revealed their capabilities too early. They had shown their hand before the game was over. And now she knew exactly what she was dealing with. When he reached row 16, the hijacker stopped. Kira looked up at him. He was tall, lean, late 30s or early 40s. His face had the weathered look of someone who had spent years in harsh climates. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they held the flat affect of a man who had long ago stopped caring about the difference between right and wrong. "You," he said. Silence was her only answer. "You didn't scream." She continued to look at him. Her expression revealed nothing. "Everyone else screamed. The gun goes off. People scream. That's how it works." He tilted his head slightly. "But not you. You didn't even flinch." Kira remained silent. The hijacker leaned closer. She could smell cigarette smoke on his breath mingled with something else, something chemical. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I've seen your type before. Military, probably special operations, sitting there calculating angles and distances, thinking about how you're going to save the day." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Here's the thing. You're not. Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. I've got 4 men on this plane, including the one who's currently flying it. The moment you move, someone dies. Maybe you. Maybe that old man with the little girl. Maybe the fat guy in business class who won't stop crying. He leaned even closer. You understand me? Kira met his gaze. Yes, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled. It gave away nothing. The hijacker studied her for a long moment. Then he straightened up and smiled again. Good girl. He walked away. Kira watched him go. Her heart rate had increased by approximately 8 beats per minute during the exchange. Her breathing had remained steady. Her hands had not moved from her lap. She had learned long ago that survival in high-stress situations depended on controlling the body's responses. Fear was useful. It sharpened the senses and quickened the reflexes, but only if it remained harnessed. Let it run wild and it became a liability. She took a slow breath and let it out. 4 hijackers total. 1 in the cockpit, apparently the leader. 3 in the cabin. The one who had just spoken to her was coordinating operations. The heavy-set one with the knife was patrolling the rear. The 4th was stationed near the mid-cabin galley, watching the center section. The one in the cockpit, the man in the Navy windbreaker, was the key. He had moved with confidence and precision. He had known exactly how to breach the cockpit door. He was running this operation. The others were soldiers, capable but not leaders. Take out the head and the body would follow. But not yet. Not until she understood the full picture. Not until she knew what they wanted and where they were taking this aircraft. Patience was not passive. It was not surrender. It was the recognition that timing mattered more than speed, and that the right moment was worth more than 100 wrong ones. The right moment would come. She would be ready. The next 15 minutes passed in oppressive silence. The hijackers moved through the cabin with methodical efficiency, collecting phones and passports in a black garbage bag. The passengers complied without resistance, their faces blank with shock. Diane Caldwell moved among them, offering quiet words of reassurance where she could. The hijackers allowed it, apparently deciding that a calm cabin was easier to control than a panicked one. Kira watched the flight attendant work. There was something impressive about the way Diane maintained her composure. She had been threatened at gunpoint, watched armed men take control of her aircraft, and was now surrounded by terrified passengers. Yet she moved through the cabin with the same steady professionalism she had shown during the beverage service. 20 years of experience, Kira estimated. Maybe more. This was not her first crisis, and she had learned that the best way through was to keep moving. When Diane reached row 16, she paused briefly beside Kira's seat. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Diane moved on. At the 73-minute mark, the hijacker with the knife began a new patrol. He moved down the aisle, slowly pausing at each row to study the passengers. Looking for threats. Looking for potential problems. She had heard the others call him Briggs. Not his real name, probably. Operational call sign. The kind of thing mercenaries use to maintain distance from their own identities. When he reached row 14, he stopped. Walter Brennan looked up at him. The little girl Lily was clutching her grandfather's arm, her face buried against his shoulder. Her stuffed rabbit was crushed between them like a shield. Cute kid, Briggs said. Walter held his gaze without flinching. How old? 7. Briggs nodded. Where are you taking her? Walter's voice was steady, but Kira could hear the strain beneath it. Washington, to see her mother. Her mother in Washington, in a hospital. Walter paused. She's dying, cancer. We're going to say goodbye. Briggs was silent for a moment, then he smiled. Tough break, he said. Hope you make it in time. He walked away. Kira watched Walter's face as the hijacker moved on. The old man's expression did not change, but his hand tightened around his granddaughter, pulling her closer, as if trying to shield her from everything the world could throw at her. There was a courage in that gesture. A quiet, desperate courage that asked for nothing and expected nothing except the chance to protect what he loved. Kira looked away. She had a mission now. It had nothing to do with medals or ceremonies or ghosts she could not outrun. It had to do with an old man and a little girl and a stuffed rabbit and a mother dying in a hospital 3,000 miles away. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. And some things were simply unacceptable. At the 80-minute mark, the hijacker with the baseball cap returned to Kira's row. She had learned his name was Cole. The mid-cabin hijacker, the fourth one, who had been stationed near the galley, was called Nash. 4 men, 4 names, all probably fake. Cole stopped beside her seat and looked down. "You again?" She held his gaze without a word. "You know what I don't like about you," he said. "You're too calm. It's not natural. Everyone else on this plane is scared out of their minds, and you're sitting there like you're waiting for a bus." He leaned closer. "What are you waiting for?" Her expression gave nothing away. Cole's eyes narrowed. "My boss thinks you're military. He thinks you're dangerous. But you know what I think. I think you're just scared like everyone else. You're just better at hiding it." He reached out and tapped the tray table in front of her with the barrel of his pistol. "Don't try to be brave, lady. That's not your role here. Your role is to sit there and shut up and wait for this to be over. You do anything I don't like, and I promise you, you'll be the first to regret it." He straightened up and walked away toward the rear of the cabin. Kira watched him go. Then she looked down at her hands still folded in her lap. They were steady, completely steady. Cole was right about one thing. She was waiting, but he was wrong about what she was waiting for. She was waiting for the moment when the odds shifted, the moment when opportunity and necessity aligned, the moment when the cost of action became less than the cost of inaction. That moment was coming. She could feel it approaching, like a storm front on the horizon. When it arrived, she would not hesitate. She would not negotiate. She would not show mercy. She would do what she had been trained to do, what she had spent years perfecting, what had become as natural to her as breathing. She would end this. And she would make sure that an old man and his granddaughter made it to Washington in time to say goodbye. The aircraft droned on through the empty sky. 83 minutes into the flight, 97 passengers, 4 hijackers, and 1 woman in seat 16C who had already begun to calculate the angles. The storm was coming, and when it broke, nothing would ever be the same. 87 minutes into the flight. The cabin had settled into a strange equilibrium. The initial terror had faded into something duller and more persistent, a low hum of fear that vibrated through every passenger like a current running beneath the surface of still water. Kira Vance remained in seat 16C. She had not moved since the takeover began. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Her breathing remained slow and measured. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what the hijackers wanted, a compliant passenger waiting for the ordeal to end. But behind her eyes, a different process was unfolding. She had spent the past 40 minutes mapping every detail of the cabin, the positions of the 4 hijackers, their patrol patterns, the intervals between their movements, the blind spots in their coverage. Cole, the one with the baseball cap, had established himself near the forward galley, watching the front half of the cabin. He checked his watch every 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Consistent, predictable. Briggs, the knife holder, patrolled the rear section in a loose figure-8 pattern. His intervals were less regular, ranging from 3 to 6 minutes between passes. He was the wild card, the one she would need to watch most carefully. Nash, the 4th hijacker, held position near the mid-cabin galley. He was the quietest of the 3, rarely speaking, rarely moving. But his eyes never stopped scanning. He was the most disciplined of the cabin team. The leader, Dominic Marsh, remained in the cockpit. She had not seen him since the initial takeover, but his voice had come over the intercom twice more, with updates that revealed nothing useful. 4 targets, 4 separate zones of control. And somewhere in the gaps between them, opportunities were beginning to form. Kira waited. Patience was not passive. It was not surrender. It was the recognition that timing mattered more than speed, and that the right moment was worth more than 100 wrong ones. The right moment would come. She would be ready. The hijacker named Cole began another circuit of the forward cabin. He moved down the aisle with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the power his weapon gave him. He made eye contact with passengers as he passed, daring them to look away first. Most did. When he reached row 14, he paused. Walter Brennan was still holding his granddaughter. Lily had woken from her exhausted sleep and was now staring at the hijacker with wide, frightened eyes. Her stuffed rabbit was crushed against her chest like a shield. Cole looked down at them. "Still here, old man?" Walter met his gaze without flinching. Where else would I be? Cole laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. I like you, he said. You've got spine. Most of these people are ready to wet themselves every time I walk by, but not you. Why is that? Walter's voice was steady. I've been scared before. It doesn't help anything. Cole tilted his head, studying the old man, with something that might have been respect. Military, Army, Vietnam, long time ago. No kidding. Cole's smile widened. What unit? 1st Cavalry Division, Ia Drang Valley, 1965. Something shifted in Cole's expression. The smile remained, but it became more genuine, more personal. My old man was Army too. Served in the Gulf. Never talked about it much. Walter nodded slowly. Most of us don't. For a moment, the two men looked at each other across the vast gulf that separated them. One a passenger, one a hijacker, one an old soldier with nothing left to lose except the child in his arms. One a young mercenary who had traded his honor for money and was only now beginning to understand the cost. Then Cole's smile hardened again. Stay calm, old-timer. Do what you're told and maybe you'll make it to that hospital in time. He walked away. Kira watched the exchange with interest. Cole had shown something just now. A crack in the armor. A hint of humanity beneath the professional violence. That crack might be useful later. She filed it away and continued to wait. 93 minutes. The aircraft had been flying for over an hour and a half now. Based on their original flight plan, they should have been somewhere over Kansas, approaching the midpoint of their journey to Washington. But they were not over Kansas. Kira could feel the difference in the aircraft's orientation. The angle of the sun through the windows had shifted. The subtle pressure changes in the cabin told her they had altered course significantly. They were heading west now, away from Washington, away from populated areas. That was not an accident. Dominic Marsh had chosen their route carefully. He was taking them somewhere specific, somewhere isolated, somewhere that regular flight paths did not reach. Kira thought about the abandoned military installations scattered across the western United States. Decommissioned Air Force bases, former Strategic Air Command facilities, Cold War relics that had been left to decay in the high desert. Any one of them could serve as a landing site for a commercial aircraft. Runways long enough, infrastructure abandoned but intact, no witnesses, no interference. The question was what happened after they landed. Ransom negotiations required contact with authorities. Political statements required media coverage. Neither of those things was possible in the middle of nowhere, which meant this was something else, something that required an aircraft in isolation and 97 passengers who had no idea what was coming. Kira did not like any of the possibilities that suggested. At the 96-minute mark, Diane Caldwell began moving through the cabin. The hijackers had allowed her limited freedom to attend to passengers. Water, bathroom breaks. Basic medical attention for Cody Tanner, who had regained consciousness, but remained slumped in his seat, nursing what was probably a concussion. Diane moved with the same steady professionalism she had displayed throughout the crisis. She spoke quietly to passengers as she passed, checking on them, reassuring them, maintaining the fragile calm that was the only thing keeping the cabin from descending into chaos. When she reached row 16, she paused. Water. Kira nodded. Diane handed her a small bottle. As she did, her fingers brushed against Kira's palm. There was something there, a small folded piece of paper pressed into her hand with the bottle. Kira's expression did not change. Thank you, she said. Diane moved on. Kira waited until Briggs had completed his next patrol of the rear cabin. Then, using her body to shield her movements from observation, she unfolded the paper beneath the edge of her tray table. 4 words, hastily written in blue ink. Cockpit camera. Shows cabin. Kira read the message twice. Then she crumpled the paper and slipped it into her pocket. The information was significant. It meant that Dominic Marsh could see everything happening in the cabin. Every movement, every interaction, every potential threat. It also meant that any action she took would be observed in real time. She would have to account for that. The problem was not insurmountable. Camera feeds had limitations. Resolution? Angle? the inability to capture peripheral movement. If she timed her actions correctly, she could exploit the gaps between what the camera could see and what Marsh could process. But it added another variable to an already complex equation. Kira adjusted her calculations and continued to wait. 104 minutes. Briggs made another pass through the rear cabin. Unlike Cole, he had not engaged with any of the passengers beyond, barked commands and threatening gestures. He moved in silence, his eyes scanning the rows with the focused intensity of a predator. But the intensity was starting to fray at the edges. Kira could see it in the way he gripped his knife. Too tight, the tendons in his forearms standing out like cables beneath his skin. She could see it in the rapid movement of his eyes, checking and rechecking the same positions, looking for threats that were not there. Briggs was operating on adrenaline. He had been in a heightened state of alertness for nearly 2 hours now, and the human body was not designed to sustain that level of stress indefinitely. He was starting to crack. That made him more dangerous in some ways, unpredictable, prone to overreaction, but it also made him vulnerable. His judgment was compromised. His reaction time was slowing, even as his anxiety increased. When the moment came, Briggs would be the weak link. Kira watched him complete his patrol and return to his position near the rear galley. Then she turned her attention to the forward cabin. Cole was leaning against the galley counter, his pistol held loosely at his side. He was talking to the young flight attendant in a low voice. She was nodding rapidly, her face pale with fear. Whatever he was saying, it was not a casual conversation. Kira watched the attendant's body language, the way she kept glancing toward the rear of the cabin, the way her hands twisted together in front of her. She was being given instructions, specific instructions that she did not want to follow. The conversation ended. Cole straightened up and resumed his position near the cockpit door. The young attendant stood frozen for a moment, then began walking slowly toward the rear of the cabin. She passed row 16 without making eye contact with anyone. Kira watched her go. Something was changing. The dynamic was shifting. Whatever Dominic Marsh had planned, it was entering a new phase. The storm was getting closer. 112 minutes. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Dominic Marsh's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I wanted to give you an update on our progress. We're currently about 40 minutes from our destination. The weather is clear, and we're expecting a smooth approach." He paused. "I also want to address something. I know some of you are scared. I know some of you are thinking about being heroes, thinking about rushing my men, thinking about somehow turning this situation around." Another pause, longer this time. "I want you to understand something. My men are professionals. They've done this before, and the gentleman who thought he could be a hero earlier, he's currently nursing a concussion and a bruised ego." Kira glanced toward Cody Tanner, still slumped in his seat, his face gray with pain and humiliation. "So here's my advice," Marsh continued. "Don't be a hero. Heroes die. Passengers live. Choose wisely." The intercom clicked off. Kira processed the message. Marsh was worried. The speech about heroism was not confidence. It was preemption. He was trying to discourage action before it could begin. That meant he knew his control was not absolute. He knew that somewhere in this cabin there were people who might be willing to fight back. He was right, but his warning had told her something else, something more important. He had mentioned heroes, plural. He was watching the cabin through the camera. He had seen her, noted her stillness, recognized her as a potential threat. He was paying attention to her specifically, and he was afraid of what she might do. Good. Fear was a weapon. And right now, Dominic Marsh had just given her a piece of intelligence that he did not intend to share. He was watching her, which meant his attention was divided, which meant there were moments when he was focused on her position and not on others. She could use that. 119 minutes. The young flight attendant returned from the rear of the cabin. She walked quickly, her head down, her arms wrapped around herself. When she reached the forward galley, she stopped and leaned against the counter, her shoulders trembling. Cole said something to her. She nodded without looking up. Then she began preparing something. Kira could not see exactly what. The galley blocked her view, but she could hear the sounds. Plastic wrappers being torn, liquid being poured. A minute later, the attendant emerged with a tray of small cups. She began distributing them to passengers. "Water," she said quietly as she moved down the aisle. "Please drink." Kira watched her approach. The attendant's hands were shaking. The cups rattled slightly on the tray. And there was something in her eyes, something that looked like apology. When she reached row 16, she held out a cup toward Kira. Kira did not take it. "What is it?" The attendant's voice was barely a whisper. "Just water. Please." "What did they put in it?" The attendant's face crumpled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I'm so sorry. They said they would kill me if I didn't. They said they would kill everyone." Kira looked at the cup. Then she looked at the attendant. "How much?" "I don't know. They gave me packets. Told me to mix one into each cup. I don't know what it is." Sedatives. That was the only thing that made sense. Marsh wanted the passengers unconscious, compliant, unable to resist whatever came next. Kira glanced down the aisle. Several passengers had already accepted their cups. Some were drinking. Others held the cups in trembling hands, staring at the contents with uncertainty. She looked back at the attendant. "Don't give any more out." "But they said, tell them you ran out. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but do not give any more out. Do you understand?" The attendant's eyes widened. "Who are you?" Kira held her gaze. "Do you understand?" she repeated. The attendant nodded slowly. "Yes, yes, I understand." She moved on, but Kira noticed she did not offer cups to the remaining passengers. Kira watched her go. The situation had just accelerated. Marsh was moving to neutralize the passengers. That meant whatever he had planned for the destination was something he did not want witnesses to see, something he did not want anyone to survive. Time was running out. 124 minutes? Inside the cockpit, Captain Ray Hollis sat rigidly in the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the yoke. He had been flying for 32 years, 18 of those in the Air Force, including combat missions during Desert Storm, the remaining 14 with commercial airlines carrying passengers safely across the country and around the world. He had never lost an aircraft, never lost a passenger, never faced a situation he could not handle, until today. Dominic Marsh stood behind him close enough that Hollis could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. The hijacker held a pistol loosely at his side, but his attention was divided between the cockpit instruments and a small monitor mounted on the center console. The monitor showed a feed from the cabin camera. "She hasn't moved," Marsh said. Hollis did not respond. "The woman in 16C, she's been sitting there for 2 hours perfectly still. No panic, no fear, just watching." Hollis kept his eyes on the instruments. "Most people would have done something by now," Marsh continued. "Cried, screamed, tried to be a hero like that idiot contractor. But not her. She's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Marsh smiled. "That's the question, isn't it?" "Waiting for what?" He leaned closer to the monitor. "She's military. I'd bet my life on it. The way she carries herself, the way she assessed my men when they moved. She's calculating something." Hollis glanced at the monitor. He could see the woman Marsh was talking about. Seat 16C. Dark hair, gray windbreaker, sitting motionless with her hands folded in her lap. There was something familiar about the way she held herself, the controlled stillness, the economy of movement. He had seen it before in pilots and special operators who had learned to conserve energy until the moment it was needed. "What are you going to do about her?" Hollis asked. Marsh straightened up. "Nothing. Yet. She's smart enough to know that any move she makes will get people killed. As long as she stays in her seat, she's not a threat. And if she doesn't stay in her seat," Marsh's smile faded, "then she becomes an example." He turned back to the monitor. On the screen, the woman in 16C remained perfectly still, but Hollis noticed something that Marsh had missed. Her eyes were not watching the cabin. They were looking directly at the camera. She knew she was being watched, and she did not care. 129 minutes. Kira made her decision. She had been waiting for the perfect moment, the ideal convergence of opportunity and necessity. But perfect moments were rare, and the cost of waiting had just increased dramatically. She could not let the passengers be sedated. She could not let Marsh gain that level of control, and she could not let this aircraft reach its destination without knowing what waited for them there. She had to act, soon, within the next few minutes, but she could not do it alone. Kira looked toward the forward galley. Diane Caldwell was standing near the beverage cart watching the young attendant with an expression of carefully controlled alarm. She had not drunk anything herself. She knew. Their eyes met. Kira held up one finger. Then she pointed toward the rear of the cabin. Then she held up 3 fingers. 1 minute. Rear cabin. 3. Diane's eyes widened slightly. Then she nodded almost imperceptibly. Kira turned her attention to the knife holder at the rear of the cabin. Briggs was standing near the lavatory door, his back against the wall. He had a clear line of sight down the entire aisle, but his attention was focused forward on Cole and the cockpit door. He was not watching his flanks. Kira looked at the passengers around her. Row 15, a woman in her 30s clutching her purse like a lifeline. Not useful. Row 17, an older man heavyset staring straight ahead with the blank expression of someone who had retreated into himself. Not useful. Row 14, Walter Brennan, still holding his granddaughter, still watching the hijackers with those steady, unafraid eyes. Kira made a decision. She leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust her position. As she did, she caught Walter's eye. The old man looked at her. Kira held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded toward Briggs at the rear of the cabin. Then she held up one finger. 1 minute. Walter's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition, an understanding. He had been a soldier once. He knew what she was asking. He nodded. Kira straightened up and let her hands rest on the armrests of her seat. 57 seconds. The cabin remained quiet. The passengers who had drunk the sedated water were beginning to show signs of drowsiness, their heads nodding, their eyes losing focus. 43 seconds. Briggs shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His knife hand flexed and relaxed. Flexed and relaxed. 31 seconds. Cole turned away from the cockpit door to say something to the young flight attendant. 22 seconds. Diane Caldwell picked up a coffee pot from the galley cart and began walking toward the rear of the cabin. 15 seconds. Kira felt her heartbeat slow. Her breathing deepened, the world narrowing to a single point of focus. 8 seconds. Walter Brennan gently shifted his granddaughter's sleeping form, placing her carefully against the window. 3 seconds. Diane reached the midpoint of the cabin. 2 seconds. 1. Everything happened at once. Diane dropped the coffee pot. The crash echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Hot liquid splashed across the floor. Passengers screamed. Heads turned toward the sound. Briggs spun toward the noise, his knife coming up instinctively. And Kira moved. She was out of her seat before Briggs completed his turn. 3 steps. 4. Moving low, staying below the sight line of the seats. Briggs saw her coming. His eyes widened. His mouth opened to shout a warning. He never got the chance. Kira closed the distance in a heartbeat. Her left hand caught his knife wrist, redirecting the blade away from her body. Her right elbow drove into his throat with surgical precision. The impact crushed his windpipe. Briggs made a choking sound. His free hand clawed at his neck. The knife clattered to the floor. Kira did not stop. She pivoted behind him, wrapping her arm around his throat in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain. 8 seconds. That was all it took. 8 seconds of sustained pressure and unconsciousness followed. Briggs went limp. Kira lowered him to the floor and retrieved the knife. The entire engagement had taken less than 6 seconds. The passengers in the rear cabin were staring at her with expressions of shock. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were frozen in their seats, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Kira did not have time for their shock. She turned toward the forward cabin. Cole had heard the commotion. He was already moving his pistol, coming up as he pushed past passengers toward the rear. "Briggs, what the hell is—" He saw Kira standing over the unconscious body. He saw the knife in her hand. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Then Cole raised his pistol. Kira was already moving. She grabbed the nearest passenger, an elderly woman who had frozen in terror, and pulled her down below the level of the seats. The first shot went high, punching through the overhead bin and sending debris raining down. Screaming erupted throughout the cabin. Kira rolled into the aisle, staying low. The second shot passed over her head by inches. She could hear the supersonic crack of the bullet splitting the air. She came up fast, using a seat as cover. Cole was advancing his pistol, tracking her movement, but he was moving too quickly. His shooting stance was compromised. His accuracy was suffering. Amateur. Kira waited for the gap between shots. 1 second. 2. Cole fired again. Wide left. She moved. 3 steps across the aisle. Close the distance. Get inside his reach. Cole tried to track her. Too slow. His pistol arm swung around, but she was already inside his guard. Her left hand caught his wrist, forcing the weapon up toward the ceiling. Her right hand drove a palm strike into his solar plexus with enough force to fold him in half. He gasped. The pistol fired once more, the bullet punching through the ceiling and into the space above. Kira twisted his wrist. Something cracked. Cole screamed. The pistol fell. She caught it before it hit the ground. In one smooth motion, she reversed her grip, brought the weapon up, and pressed the barrel against Cole's forehead. Don't! The single word was enough. Cole froze. Behind her, she heard passengers screaming, crying. Some were trying to flee toward the back of the plane. Others were huddled in their seats, too terrified to move. Kira kept her focus on Cole. On your knees, hands behind your head. Cole complied. His face was twisted with pain from his broken wrist, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something that looked almost like respect. You're her, he said through gritted teeth. Marsh said there was someone on this plane. Someone dangerous. I didn't believe him. She pressed the pistol harder against his forehead. Where is this plane going? Cole laughed. It came out as a wet, pained sound. You think I know Marsh doesn't tell us anything. Just follow orders. Get paid. That's the deal. What happens when we land? I don't know. Guess. Cole's smile faded. Nothing good. Whatever Marsh has planned, it's not ransom. It's not political. It's something else. He paused. Something big enough that he doesn't want any witnesses left behind. Kira processed the information. No witnesses. That confirmed her suspicions. Whatever waited at their destination, it was not designed to end peacefully. How many men in the cockpit? Just Marsh. And whatever's left of your flight crew. Is the captain alive? Last I heard, Marsh needs someone to land the plane. Kira nodded slowly. She had what she needed. Diane, she called out without turning. Secure him. Use the restraints from the beverage cart. Diane Caldwell appeared at her side, moving with the same steady calm she had displayed throughout the crisis. She was carrying a handful of plastic zip ties. Where did you get those? Emergency kit, Diane said. We keep them for unruly passengers. She began binding Cole's wrist behind his back. Kira stepped back and surveyed the cabin. 2 hijackers down, both neutralized. 1 remained unaccounted for. Nash, the 4th hijacker, the one who had been stationed near the mid-cabin galley. She scanned the rows but found only terrified passengers. He had either fled during the chaos or was hiding among the crowd, another variable to account for. Diane, she said. The 4th one? Nash. Did you see where he went? Diane shook her head. He disappeared when the shooting started. I lost track of him. Kira's jaw tightened. 3 targets down, 1 missing, and Dominic Marsh still in control of the cockpit. The equation had improved, but it was not yet solved. She looked toward the cockpit door. The reinforced barrier stood between her and the man who had orchestrated this entire operation. Standard Boeing security door. Reinforced composite. Electronic lock controlled from inside. Getting through it would not be easy, but first she needed to deal with the missing hijacker. She started walking toward the mid-cabin, pistol raised, scanning each row. Row 20, clear. Row 21, clear. Row 22, clear. Row 23, clear. Row 24. She found him. Nash was slumped against the window, unconscious. Blood ran from a gash on his temple. Standing over him was a large man with construction worker hands holding a fire extinguisher, like a baseball bat. "He tried to run," the man said simply. "I didn't let him." Kira looked at the unconscious hijacker, then at the man who had stopped him. "What's your name?" "Patterson. Mike Patterson. I work construction in Denver." He paused. "I don't know who you are, lady, but whatever you're doing, I figured I'd help." Kira allowed herself a small nod. "You did good, Mike. Secure him with the others." She continued toward the front of the cabin. 3 hijackers neutralized. 1 remained. The hardest part was still ahead. Walter Brennan met her in the aisle near row 14. "What now?" he asked. Kira looked at him. The old man's face was pale, but his eyes were steady. His granddaughter was still sleeping against the window, somehow undisturbed by the chaos that had erupted around her. "Now," Kira said, "we take back the cockpit." "How?" She looked at the reinforced door. "I'm still working on that part." Walter followed her gaze. "I was a door gunner in Vietnam," he said quietly. "We didn't do subtle, but I know how to create a distraction." Kira studied him for a long moment. He was 65 years old, maybe older. His hands were weathered and spotted with age. His body had lost the strength it once possessed, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen death up close and learned not to fear it. The eyes of a man who had spent 50 years carrying the weight of things he could not forget. The eyes of a soldier who had never truly stopped being a soldier. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Walter smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen on his face since the flight began. "Something that will get Marsh's attention," he said. "Something that will make him think the whole cabin is coming for him." He looked back at his sleeping granddaughter. "She's going to see her mother," he said quietly. "One way or another. I promised her that." Kira nodded. "Then let's make sure you keep that promise." She handed him the knife she had taken from Briggs. "Stay 3 rows behind me. When I reach the cockpit door, create noise. Get passengers moving. Make Marsh think we're mounting a full assault." Walter took the knife and tested its balance. "And if things go wrong—" "They won't." She started forward. Walter followed at a distance, the knife hidden against his leg. The storm had broken, and nothing would ever be the same. 134 minutes into the flight. Kira Vance reached the forward cabin, Cole's pistol steady in her hand. She had taken it during the struggle, and now it felt like an extension of her arm. Walter Brennan had positioned himself 3 rows back, as instructed. His weathered hands gripped the knife she had given him. Between them, passengers sat frozen in their seats, watching the woman who had just dismantled 3 armed hijackers in less than 2 minutes. Kira stopped 15 feet from the cockpit door. The cabin had fallen into an eerie silence. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engines and the quiet sobbing of passengers too shocked to do anything else. Diane Caldwell stood near the forward galley, her face pale but determined. She had secured Cole and was now watching Kira with a mixture of fear and something that looked almost like hope. "The door," Kira said quietly. "What do you know about it?" "Standard Boeing security door. Reinforced composite, electronic lock controlled from inside the cockpit. There's a keypad on this side, but the code was changed when they took over. Emergency override. There's a manual release, but it requires a specific sequence. 3 knocks, pause 2 knocks, then the code." Kira looked at the door. It was designed to withstand a considerable amount of force. Bulletproof panels, reinforced hinges. The kind of barrier that had been installed on every commercial aircraft after September 11th to prevent exactly this kind of situation. But every barrier had weaknesses. She remembered her training, the hours spent studying aircraft security systems, the simulations where they had practiced breaching reinforced doors under combat conditions. The door itself was nearly impenetrable. The frame was not. "Diane," she said, "the emergency equipment locker. Is there a crash axe?" "Yes, standard safety equipment." "Get it." Diane moved quickly to the storage panel beside the galley. She popped the latch and retrieved a red-handled axe with a pointed tip on one end and a flat blade on the other. Kira took it and tested its weight. Heavy, solid, designed to cut through aircraft fuselage in an emergency evacuation. It would serve another purpose today. She looked at Walter. When I start on the door, Marsh will know something is happening. He'll have two choices: come out and fight or stay inside and wait for me to break through. What do you think he'll do? Stay inside. He needs the pilots to land the plane. He won't risk losing control of the cockpit. So we're breaking in. We're breaking in. Walter nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Distraction. When I start cutting, I need you to make noise. Lots of it. Get the passengers moving. Create chaos. Make Marsh think the whole cabin is rising up against him. That shouldn't be hard. These folks have been scared long enough. They're ready to do something. Kira looked at him. You understand what this means. If Marsh has a weapon, if he decides to fight, people could get hurt. You could get hurt. Walter's expression did not change. Lady, I've been living on borrowed time since 1965. Every day since then has been a gift I didn't earn. He glanced back toward row 14 where his granddaughter still slept against the window. But she hasn't had her time yet, and I'll be damned if I let some mercenary take that away from her. Kira held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. On my signal. She moved toward the cockpit door. 137 minutes. Kira positioned herself beside the door, the crash axe raised. The frame was the weak point. The composite panels could withstand bullets, but the mounting points where the door met the fuselage were standard aviation aluminum. Strong but not impenetrable. If she could compromise the frame, the door would come free regardless of the lock. She took a breath. Now! Walter Brennan's voice cut through the silence like a thunderclap. Everybody up on your feet. We're taking this plane back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers who had been frozen in terror suddenly found their voices. Some screamed. Others shouted. A few actually stood up, swept along by the sudden surge of energy. The noise was deafening. Kira swung the axe. The first blow struck the door frame just above the lock mechanism. The impact sent vibrations up her arms and into her shoulders. A crack appeared in the aluminum. She swung again. The crack widened. Inside the cockpit, she could hear movement. Marsh's voice sharp and angry, shouting something she could not make out. Third swing. The frame buckled. Fourth swing. The door shifted in its mount. Not much. A quarter inch maybe. But it was enough. Fifth swing. The aluminum around the upper hinge tore free. Kira dropped the axe and drove her shoulder into the door. It gave way with a screech of tortured metal, swinging inward at an angle as the remaining hinge bent under the force. She was through. The cockpit was smaller than she remembered from her training simulations. 2 pilot seats facing a wall of instruments and displays. Emergency lighting casting everything in shades of amber and red. Captain Ray Hollis was slumped in the left seat, blood running from a gash on his forehead. His hands were bound to the armrest with zip ties. His co-pilot was in worse shape, unconscious in the right seat, with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his head. And standing in the narrow space between them, a pistol in his hand, was Dominic Marsh. He was younger than she had expected from his voice. Late 30s, clean-shaven, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd. But his eyes were different. Pale gray, almost colorless, burning with an intelligence that missed nothing. Kira Vance, he said. His voice was calm, conversational, as if they were meeting at a dinner party rather than in the cockpit of a hijacked aircraft. I've been watching you since we took off. Seat 16C. The woman who didn't scream when the gun went off. I knew you were going to be a problem. Kira held the pistol steady, aimed at his center mass. She was calculating distances, angles, the trajectory of a bullet in this confined space, the position of the pilots, the location of vital instruments that could not be damaged. You're military, Marsh continued. Special operations, if I had to guess. The way you took down my men, the efficiency, the lack of hesitation. That's not something you learn in a self-defense class. Navy, Kira said. It was the first word she had spoken to him directly. Marsh's eyebrows rose slightly. Navy, interesting. Pilot, among other things. SEAL. She did not answer. She did not need to. Marsh smiled. That explains it. I've worked with SEALs before. Good operators, professional, deadly when they need to be. His smile faded. But you're not on a mission now. You're just a passenger, a civilian, and civilians don't win against professionals. He raised his pistol. Kira moved. She had been waiting for the moment his attention shifted. The fraction of a second when his focus went from conversation to action. That was the gap. That was the opening. She closed the distance in 2 steps. Her left hand caught his gun arm, forcing it up and away. The pistol discharged the bullet, punching through the ceiling and into the space above. The sound was deafening in the enclosed cockpit. Her right elbow drove into his ribs. Marsh grunted but did not go down. He was stronger than he looked. Faster. His free hand came up in a strike, aimed at her throat. She blocked it with her forearm and countered with a knee to his thigh. They struggled in the narrow space between the pilot seats. Too close for effective strikes. Too confined for leverage. Marsh twisted, trying to bring the pistol back around. Kira kept her grip on his wrist, bending it at an angle that threatened to snap the joint. He dropped the weapon. It clattered to the floor and slid under the captain's seat. Now they were both unarmed. The fight became something more primal. Close quarters combat in a space barely large enough for 2 people to stand. Elbows and knees, headbutts and gouges. The kind of fighting that happened in alleys and prison cells and the cramped interiors of enemy vehicles. Marsh was good. Better than his men. He had training that went beyond mercenary work. Something older. Something government. But Kira was better. She had spent years perfecting her body into a weapon. Thousands of hours of training, hundreds of real-world applications. She knew how to fight in spaces like this, how to use the walls and seats and instruments as tools. She drove him backward into the instrument panel. Warning lights flashed. An alarm began to sound. Marsh's hand found something on the console. A pen. Metal. Sharp enough to be a weapon. He stabbed at her face. She caught his wrist twisted and felt the bone give way with a wet snap. Marsh screamed. The pen fell. Kira did not hesitate. She drove her palm into his chin, snapping his head back. Then she grabbed him by the collar, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the damaged cockpit door frame. He went limp. She let him fall. The fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. Kira stood over the unconscious hijacker, breathing hard. A fine tremor ran through her fingers. Adrenaline. It would pass. She turned to Captain Hollis. "Can you fly?" Hollis looked up at her through the blood running down his face. His eyes were clear, alert. The eyes of a man who had been in combat before and knew how to function through pain. "I can fly," he said, "but my co-pilot is out cold. I'll need help." "You'll have it." She retrieved the fallen pen and used its pointed tip to cut through the zip ties binding his wrists. Hollis flexed his hands, restoring circulation. "Who are you?" Kira did not answer immediately. She was checking Marsh's pulse. Still alive. Still breathing. She found a length of cord in the emergency kit and bound his hands behind his back. "Navy," she said finally. "Retired." Hollis studied her for a long moment. "You're more than that." She met his gaze. "Does it matter?" He considered the question. Then he nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." He turned back to the controls and began assessing the aircraft's status. "We're off course, way off course. Current heading puts us somewhere over western Wyoming. We've lost about 2,000 feet of altitude since this started, and fuel is getting low." "Can we make it back to Denver?" "No, not enough fuel. We'd run dry somewhere over the mountains." "What about an emergency landing?" Hollis was silent for a moment, studying the navigation displays. "There's a military installation about 40 miles from here. Buckley Space Force Base in Colorado. They've got runways long enough for a commercial aircraft. If I can raise them on the radio, they should be able to clear us for an emergency approach." "Do it." Hollis reached for the radio. "Buckley Control, this is Delta Flight 1847 declaring an emergency. We have experienced a hijacking situation. The aircraft is now secure. Requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. Over." Static. Then a voice. "Delta 1847, this is Buckley Control. We copy your emergency declaration. State your current position and fuel status." "Buckley, we are approximately 40 miles northwest of your position. Altitude 8,000 feet, fuel critical. We have injured aboard and require emergency services on the ground." "Copy Delta 1847. You are cleared for immediate approach to runway 28. Emergency services are being dispatched. Maintain current heading and descend to 5,000 feet. Roger Buckley, beginning descent. Hollis adjusted the controls. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly as they began their approach. Kira looked at the co-pilot's seat. You need someone in that chair. Hollis glanced at her. You said you were Navy, pilot. Helicopters mostly, but I've logged simulator time on fixed wing. Close enough. Take the seat. I'll talk you through anything you don't know. Kira slid into the co-pilot's position. The instrument panel glowed in front of her, familiar and strange at the same time. She had flown combat missions in helicopters, not commercial jets. But the principles were the same. The language of flight was universal. What do you need from me? Call out altitude and airspeed. Help me with the checklist. And pray we don't have any more surprises. Kira began reading the instruments. Altitude 7,500. Airspeed 240. Descent rate stable. Good, keep calling them out. The aircraft continued its descent toward the distant runway. 142 minutes. Kira was focused on the instruments when she heard the scream. It came from behind them, from the cabin. A child's scream, high and terrified. Her blood went cold. Lily! She turned to Hollis. Keep descending. I'll be back. What's happening? I don't know, but I'm going to find out. She pushed herself out of the co-pilot's seat and moved toward the damaged cockpit door. The cabin beyond was chaos. Passengers were standing in the aisle, some pressing toward the front, others pushing toward the rear. Diane Caldwell was shouting for everyone to stay calm, but her voice was lost in the confusion. And then Kira saw why. Walter Brennan was standing near row 20, his face ashen. His hands were empty. The knife she had given him was gone, and his granddaughter was not beside him. Where is she? Kira shouted. Where's Lily? Walter's voice cracked with anguish. She woke up. She needed the bathroom. I took her to the back, and then the soldiers started coming on, and everything got confused, and He could not finish. Kira was already running. She pushed through the crowd of passengers, her eyes scanning every row. The rear of the cabin was a maze of confused travelers and overturned luggage. She reached row 28, and she found him. Briggs. He was conscious. Somehow he had freed himself from the restraints. His face was gray with pain, his breathing ragged and wet from the damage she had done to his throat. But he was standing, and he had one arm wrapped around a small body, the other holding a knife to a tiny throat. Lily Brennan. The little girl was crying, her stuffed rabbit crushed against her chest. Her eyes were wide with terror. Tears streamed down her face. Stay back, Briggs rasped. His voice was barely a whisper, damaged by the blow she had dealt him earlier. Stay back, or I'll kill her. Kira stopped. Behind her, she heard Walter Brennan's voice, raw with anguish. Lily, oh God, Lily! Grandpa! The little girl's voice was a sob. Grandpa, help me! Briggs backed toward the emergency exit, dragging Lily with him. I'll open this door, he said. I'll open it, and we'll all die. Is that what you want? Is that what you want? Kira raised her hand slowly. No one wants that. Then let me go. Let me take the girl and I'll release her when we land. That's the deal. That's the only deal. Kira studied him. His pupils were dilated. His skin was slick with sweat. His body was running on fumes sustained only by desperation and the primal need to survive. He was not thinking clearly. He was not planning. He was reacting. And reactive enemies made mistakes. You're hurt, she said quietly. I can see it. You're having trouble breathing. Your vision is probably starting to blur. How much longer do you think you can hold that knife steady? Briggs's eyes flickered. Shut up. You're running out of time. The plane is descending. In 10 minutes, we'll be on the ground, and there will be 100 armed soldiers waiting for us. What's your exit strategy? How do you get away? I said, shut up. You don't have one. You're improvising. And improvisation only works if you have options. Right now, you don't have any. Briggs's hand was starting to tremble. The knife wavered slightly against Lily's throat. Kira took a step forward. Stay back. Look at your hand. Look at it. You can barely hold the knife. In 30 seconds, you're going to drop it. And when you do, I'm going to hurt you. Badly. The only question is whether you let the girl go first. Briggs's eyes darted around the cabin looking for escape routes that did not exist. You're lying. You're trying to trick me. I'm telling you the truth. I'm telling you what's going to happen. The only thing you can control now is how much it hurts. She took another step. Don't, I'll do it, His hand spasmed. The knife dipped away from Lily's throat. Just for a moment. Just a fraction of an inch. Kira moved. She crossed the remaining distance in a heartbeat. Her left hand caught his knife wrist, forcing the blade away from the child. Her right arm wrapped around Lily's small body, pulling her free. In the same motion, she pivoted, drove her knee into Briggs's solar plexus, and slammed him backward into the emergency exit door. He crumpled. The knife fell. It was over. Lily was sobbing, her small hands clutching at Kira's windbreaker. Her stuffed rabbit had fallen to the floor. Walter Brennan rushed forward, tears streaming down his face. Lily! Oh, thank God, thank God! Kira transferred the child into his arms. The old man held his granddaughter like she was made of glass, his weathered hands trembling as he stroked her hair. It's okay, sweetheart. It's okay. Grandpa's got you. Grandpa's got you. Kira stepped back. Her hands trembled with residual adrenaline. Not from fear, from something else. Something she had not felt in a long time. She looked at the little girl crying in her grandfather's arms. She thought about the mother waiting in a hospital in Washington, the mother who might never see her daughter again if things had gone differently. She thought about the 3 teammates she had lost in Afghanistan, the ones she could not save. Not this time. This time everyone was going home. We're beginning our final approach. Captain Hollis's voice came over the intercom, steady and professional. All passengers, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Emergency services are standing by. We're going to be on the ground in 5 minutes. The cabin fell silent. Kira made her way back to the cockpit. Hollis was hunched over the controls, his face tight with concentration. Blood had dried on his forehead, but his hands were steady on the yoke. How are we looking? Runway is in sight. Wind is manageable. We're going to make it. She slid into the co-pilot's seat. The instrument panel glowed in front of her. Through the windscreen, she could see the runway in the distance, a long strip of concrete cutting through the brown Colorado landscape. Emergency vehicles lined the edges, their lights flashing red and blue. Altitude 4,000, airspeed 200. Gear down. She reached for the lever and pulled it. 3 green lights illuminated on the panel. Gear down and locked. Flaps 20. She adjusted the flap lever. Flaps 20. The runway grew larger through the windscreen. Altitude 2,000, airspeed 180. Looking good. Maintain descent. The aircraft sank toward the earth. 1,000 feet, 500, 200. The runway rushed up to meet them. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20. The wheels touched concrete with a screech of rubber. The aircraft lurched. Kira braced herself against the console as the reverse thrusters engaged, and the brakes bit into the runway. They rolled. Slower, slower. And then they stopped. Silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Captain Hollis let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the intercom, welcome to Buckley Space Force Base. Please remain seated until emergency personnel have boarded the aircraft. And on behalf of the flight crew, thank you for your patience. He turned to Kira. Thank you, he said simply. She nodded. You did the hard part. No. He shook his head slowly. I flew the plane. You saved everyone on it. There's a difference. The cabin door opened. Uniformed soldiers poured onto the aircraft, weapons ready. Medical personnel followed close behind, rushing to attend to the injured. Kira stood. Her body ached in a dozen places. Her hands were scraped and bruised. Her windbreaker was torn. But she was alive. They were all alive. She stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin. The passengers were being evacuated, now guided off the aircraft by calm, professional hands. Some were crying. Others were simply staring still, unable to process what they had survived. Walter Brennan was standing in the aisle, Lily in his arms. The little girl had stopped crying. Her face was buried in her grandfather's shoulder, the stuffed rabbit clutched between them. He looked at Kira as she approached. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do. You saved my granddaughter's life. You saved all of our lives." Kira looked at the little girl. "She's going to see her mother," she said quietly. "That's all the thanks I need." Walter's eyes glistened. "God bless you," he whispered. "Whoever you are, God bless you." He walked past her carrying his granddaughter toward the exit. Kira watched them go. Then she turned and walked toward the emergency exit at the rear of the cabin, where soldiers were securing the restrained hijackers. Diane Caldwell was standing nearby, her uniform disheveled, her face exhausted but calm. "Is it over?" she asked. Kira looked around the cabin, at the soldiers, the paramedics, the passengers being led to safety, the hijackers being carried out in restraints. "Yes," she said. "It's over." She started walking toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the empty aisle. As she passed row 16, she paused and looked at the seat where she had spent most of the flight, the seat where she had watched and waited and calculated. It seemed like a lifetime ago. She kept walking. At the door, she stopped. The Colorado sun was setting in the west, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of snow from the distant mountains. Freedom? She had forgotten what it tasted like. A soldier approached her. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions." She nodded. "Of course. Can I get your name?" She paused. Her windbreaker had torn open during the fight with Marsh. Through the gap, the soldier could see the edge of a tattoo on her shoulder, 3 prongs reaching upward, a symbol that meant something to those who recognized it. The trident, the mark of a Navy SEAL. The soldier's eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice different now, more respectful. "Your name?" Kira looked at him. "Vance," she said. "Kira Vance." "Thank you, ma'am. If you'll follow me, there's a debriefing area set up. The base commander would like to speak with you personally." She nodded and started walking. As she stepped off the aircraft, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She had forgotten it was there. The hijackers had collected phones from passengers, but hers had been in her jacket, not her bag. A small oversight on their part. She pulled it out. One new message. Unknown number. She opened it. The screen displayed 4 words. "Kandahar wasn't an accident." Kira stared at the message. Her blood went cold. The ambush. The intelligence failure. The 3 teammates she had lost 18 months ago. Someone was telling her it had been deliberate. Someone knew. She looked up at the darkening sky. Behind her, the aircraft sat on the tarmac, its engines silent, its bodies scarred by the violence that had unfolded within. 97 passengers, 4 hijackers, 1 flight that had become a battleground, and 1 woman who had refused to sit down and die. The sun continued to set. Somewhere in Washington, a ceremony was being prepared. Medals would be given, speeches would be made. The memory of fallen heroes would be honored. Kira would not be there. She had her own ghost to carry, her own debts to pay, her own journey to continue. But that journey had just changed. The message on her phone had opened a door she thought was closed forever. A door to questions she had buried along with her teammates. Questions that someone somewhere did not want answered. She looked at the phone one more time. Then she slipped it back into her pocket and kept walking. The war was not over. It had only just begun. Behind her, Walter Brennan stood at the edge of the tarmac, Lily still in his arms. He watched the woman who had saved them walk toward the debriefing area, her silhouette dark against the setting sun. "Who was she, Grandpa?" Lily asked quietly. Walter was silent for a moment. "A guardian angel," he said finally. "That's who she was." Lily considered this. "Will we ever see her again?" Walter looked at the distant figure one last time. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I have a feeling she's got more work to do." He turned and carried his granddaughter toward the waiting buses. Tomorrow they would be in Washington. Tomorrow Lily would see her mother. Tomorrow they would have their goodbye. Because of a woman in seat 16C who had refused to be afraid. Because of a Navy SEAL who had answered the only question that mattered. Sit down or die neither. Neither was ever really an option, not for her, Not today, not ever.